Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we untangle complex topics by digging into a stack of sources. Today we're focusing on a place that keeps showing up in the news, a port city in Yemen called Hodeidah. You sent us a really diverse mix of materials here. I mean, everything from foundational history in Wikipedia to in-depth analysis from Brookings and Human Rights Watch, layered with really timely news reports from AP, Reuters, the Jerusalem Post, and CTV News.
That's quite a collection. And what they collectively show, I think, is that Hodeidah isn't just another city. It's a nexus of history, a vital economic artery, and crucially, a major flashpoint in Yemen's devastating conflict. And its impact ripples far beyond its borders.
Right. So our mission with this deep dive is to pull out the most essential insights from these different perspectives. We want to help you understand why this specific port is so strategically critical and, well, why it's making headlines right now. Okay, let's unpack this.
So to really grasp Hodeidah's current significance, it really helps to look back a bit. The sources show the city has been a key trading hub for centuries. I mean,
It wasn't always the major port complex it is today, but the Ottomans really developed it as a seaport back in the mid-19th century. And there was one historical detail that really stood out. The source is a difficult one. Frankly, the Mopnets mentioned that in the 19th century, it hosted a large slave market. Slaves brought from the Oronia region of Ethiopia. It's a stark reminder of its complex and sometimes pretty dark past in global trade networks.
Indeed. And that strategic appeal meant different powers have been interested over time. We saw mentions of brief Saudi occupation in 1934. And here's a really surprising nugget. During World War I, it hosted a German wireless station.
Wow, really? A German comm station?
Yeah, imagine that connection relaying communications and broadcasting propaganda all the way from Constantinople right there in Yemen.
That's a detail you definitely wouldn't expect. And later, after a major fire in the 60s, sources note the port facilities were rebuilt with Soviet aid.
Right.
It even hosted a Soviet naval base in the 70s and 80s. So this place has a long, long history of attracting significant international attention.
Historically, it was about exporting goods like coffee, cotton, dates, hides. And it was known for dhow building, too. While the main coffee trade eventually shifted south to Aden, sources show Hodeidah remained a key entry point for imports. Even back in 1920, when it was described as a poor harbor, only suitable for small boats, it was still handling significant steamship traffic.
So those have been about getting things in and out.
Exactly. Imports and exports, even if the facilities themselves weren't always, state of the art.
Okay, so it's always been strategically interesting, but fast forward to today. And its status as a port is arguably more critical than ever, though for, well, heartbreaking reasons.
Absolutely. Hodeidah is now Yemen's fourth largest city and its principal port on the Red Sea coast. But here's the single most crucial insight, the number that just jumps out from every source we looked at. Approximately 70% of everything Yemen imports essential food, medicine, fuel, humanitarian aid enters the country through this single port.
70%. Just let that sink in for a second, especially when you consider Yemen is facing one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. That doesn't just make Hodeidah important, it makes it an absolute lifeline. Any disruption here has immediate devastating consequences for millions of people who rely on those imports just to survive.
Precisely. And its location, right there on the Red Sea, places it smack in the middle of one of the world's most vital international maritime shipping lanes. So for any group or country involved in the conflict, control or even influence over this port offers immense strategic leverage. It's critical domestically for survival and critical internationally for trade and influence.
Which brings us directly to the Civil War. With 70% of imports coming through, control of Hodeidah must be a massive objective for the warring factions.
Oh, it has been a primary battleground throughout the conflict. You had forces loyal to the internationally recognized government, backed by the Saudi-led coalition, repeatedly trying to take the city from the Houthi forces. The Houthis, also known as Ansar Allah, they've held de facto control for years now.
Yeah, I remember the sources talking about the sheer fear the the global concern about what would happen if there was a full-scale siege on the port. The risk of an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe was just so high that the United Nations had to step in.
Yes, that imminent risk, that potential for mass starvation really spurred the ceasefire agreement back in December 2018. The idea was to de-escalate around the port, maybe even place it under UN control to safeguard aid flow. That led to the UN mission to support the Hodeidah agreement, or UNMHA. But despite that agreement, the sources make it pretty clear the port remains a site of military activity and control effectively remains with the Houthis.
Okay, let's look a bit more at the Houthis themselves then, based on what the sources tell us.
Sure. The sources trace their emergence back to the 1990s as a Zaidi Shiite resistance movement. Initially, their focus was more on issues like alleged government corruption. And while they are Zaidi, which is distinct from the Twelver Shiism dominant in Iran, sources do note their ties have grown closer to Iran and Hezbollah over the course of this war.
And their public messaging, their propaganda, according to the sources, frames the conflict as a fight against what they call a Saudi American-Israeli conspiracy, portraying themselves as patriots resisting foreign intervention, even if their original stated goals were more domestic.
Right. And here's where the complexity around the port really comes in. The sources repeatedly highlight this dangerous duality. On one hand, Hodeidah is absolutely essential as a humanitarian entry point. Everyone agrees on that. But on the other hand, there are consistent allegations, particularly coming from news reports and military sources, that the Houthis also use facilities in and around the port area for, well, military purposes.
Like what kind of purpose?
Like launching ballistic missiles and drones, often targeting Israel, as reported recently. And allegedly using the port for smuggling weapons and military equipment. It creates this incredibly complex, dangerous dynamic.
And this alleged military use. That's what directly connects Hodeidah to some of the very recent events detailed in the news sources you sent over. We're talking about Israeli military strikes targeting Hodeidah itself.
That's exactly right. The sources describe these strikes as a direct response to the Houthis' continued attacks against Israel, those missile and drone launches. News reports detail strikes occurring, for example, in July 2024 that impacted port facilities. And specifically, a June 10, 2025 incident noted as the Israeli Navy's first seaborne assault on Houthi targets there using missile boats.
The Israeli defense minister was quoted in one source issuing a pretty strong warning, wasn't he? Saying their long arm, both in the air and at sea, will reach everywhere, and promising a powerful response to Houthi aggression.
He even mentioned the concept of a naval and air blockade.
A blockade? That sounds serious, especially given the aid situation.
Well, according to the sources, Israeli officials state the objective of these strikes isn't necessarily to block all commercial or humanitarian traffic. The aim, they say, is specifically to degrade the Houthis' ability to launch attacks. So hitting infrastructure they allege is being used for military logistics or weapons smuggling. Reports mention previous Israeli Air Force strikes targeting alleged Houthi facilities at both Hodeidah and Sana'a Airport, too.
And the IDF, the Israeli military, even issued this striking evacuation notice specifically for 3 ports, including Hodeidah, explicitly citing the terrorist Houthi regime's use of them for terrorist activities and advising people to evacuate for their safety.
Yeah, and what's really interesting in terms of clarifying that blockade statement is how one source explained it. It wasn't presented as a literal physical blockade by ships preventing all movement. Instead, the sources clarified it as more of a strategy of repeatedly striking the ports and airport. The idea being to deter countries and businesses from even coming near them, basically making the area too risky for normal commercial or even aid operations, so it hinders the Houthis' revenue and military logistics without needing a constant physical presence.
That's a crucial distinction. It highlights the sort of complex, indirect nature of the conflict playing out here. And the sources also note that despite these strikes, this strategy, Israeli intelligence assessments reportedly find the Houthis quite difficult to actually deter. Plus, there's this wrinkle that a separate U.S. Houthi understanding apparently focuses on other issues and doesn't cover attacks on Israel. So the situation around this port just remains incredibly volatile.
And we simply cannot underscore enough how this volatility at the port, these attacks and counterattacks, directly feeds back into the humanitarian catastrophe across Yemen. Millions of Yemenis are in dire need of assistance. We're talking widespread food insecurity, lack of clean water, sanitation, a collapsing health system.
And the port's operations are just absolutely critical to alleviating any of this. When the port is disrupted, whether it's by fighting or alleged military use or these counterstrikes, the delivery of absolutely essential aid, food, medicine, fuel. it gets hindered or stopped.
Yeah.
One source explicitly stated a July 2024 attack likely damaged facilities that are key to aid shipments.
Exactly. This isn't just an inconvenience. It's literally a matter of life and death for a population already right on the brink. It exacerbates the humanitarian crisis. It drives up inflation as basic goods become scarce. It destroys livelihoods, and it deepens reliance on aid that is already struggling to get in. Sources also highlight attacks on civilian infrastructure, like food and water facilities, as clear violations of international humanitarian law.
And the sources give that really specific, devastating example of how controlling access points impact civilians in the city of Taiz.
Right.
Houthi road closures there since 2015 have apparently created this dire crisis, severely limiting access to basic necessities.
Hey.
It just shows the direct human cost of weaponizing access, whether it's roads or a major port like Hodeidah.
And the Human Rights Watch source we looked at, it painted an even broader, grimmer picture of the human cost around these contested areas. It detailed the horrific impact on children killed, maimed, recruited into fighting, schools and hospitals attacked. It highlighted the deadly legacy of landmines and unexploded ordnance used by all sides, including the Houthis, which violate international conventions and, remain a threat long after fighting stops.
Just awful.
And it documented credible accusations against all sides in the conflict, let's be clear, of abuses like arbitrary detention, torture, and forced disappearance. It's a truly devastating picture of the suffering tied to this war, centered in part around control of critical areas like Hodeidah.
So it's crystal clear Hodeidah's importance isn't confined to Yemen's borders. It has significant regional and really global implications.
Absolutely. Its location on the Red Sea makes it a vital piece in the regional power puzzle. You have countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, all noted in the sources as having strategic interests and vying for influence in Yemen. Control, or even just leverage, over Hodeidah is a major factor in that geopolitical competition. It impacts the potential for any kind of resolution or just continued conflict.
And the impact on global trade. We touched on the shipping lanes.
Massively. The Red Sea is one of the world's busiest maritime corridors. Any instability or threats originating from areas like Hodeidah have direct global consequences. The sources highlight that since late 2023, those Houthi attacks on international shipping in the Red Sea, originating from areas they control, they've targeted over 100 vessels.
Over 100.
Tragically sinking 2, killing sailors. And this has significantly forced shipping companies to reroute around Africa, drastically reducing traffic through this crucial route. A route which typically handles, get this, an astonishing $1 trillion in goods annually.
$1 trillion. Wow. So the conflict centered around this port, and the actions taken by the Houthis from areas including here, these aren't just local issues at all. They are having tangible, disruptive effects on supply chains and commerce globally. It really underscores how interconnected global security and economics are, even to seemingly distant conflicts.
Definitely. We've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? Tracing Hodeidah's history as a trading post, examining its current, absolutely vital and deeply complex role. It's a humanitarian lifeline, it's a military stronghold, it's a flashpoint in the Yemeni civil war, and now with recent international implications due to the attacks on shipping and the counterstrikes.
Yeah, its importance both domestically for sheer survival and internationally for strategy and trade is just undeniable. It's a place where history, geography, conflict, human welfare, and global economics are intensely, tragically intertwined.
Which I think raises a really important question for you, the listener, to consider as you process all this information. Given how critical vital infrastructure like ports clearly are, both for survival and for strategy in modern conflict, what does the situation in Hodeidah tell us about the profound, maybe even impossible challenges of balancing desperate humanitarian needs with competing military and geopolitical objectives in the middle of a civil war?